Well, let's turn to our panel because the leading academic Tariq Ramadan, who is Professor of Contemporary Islamic Studies at Oxford University, is here. Myriam Francois-Cerrah, a columnist at the New Statesman magazine, is also with us, and the PhD researcher working on Islamist movements. And Dr. Usama Hasan, an Islamic scholar and former jihadist fighter in Afghanistan, joins us here. He is now a senior researcher at the counter-extremism think tank, the Quilliam Foundation. Thanks to all of you for being with us, and you're going to be with us throughout this special programme. Just a quick word, first of all, on the results we have seen. It is 20 attacks a day with around 170 deaths. I mean, that gives you a snapshot of just the human cost here.
Yeah, certainly. These are going on in places of warfare. Syria and Iraq are caught in civil wars, whereas in Nigeria and the Horn of Africa, again, you have civil wars and insurgencies. I think one thing should be made very clear, that this is actually not jihad. You know, in Islam, jihad is inner and outer. The inner jihad is struggling against yourself. Outer jihad includes charity and social justice struggles, also includes military action in the last resort, warfare. These groups are involved in medieval warfare and tactics such as beheading prisoners because they reject the modern world in general. That's why they reject democracy and modern nation states, and they're fighting for this very medieval idea of a caliphate.
I'll come to some of those thoughts in a moment. Myriam, what do you make of just the basic data, the figures that show both the numbers, but 50% of those killed civilians, the vast majority Muslims?
Indeed. I would just sort of take issue, I think, with the categorization. I think to term this jihad obviously makes for great headlines and it makes for great discussions, but broadly speaking, it tends to obscure quite different phenomena that we're looking at. So Boko Haram is actually a very different group to Al-Shabaab, which is very different to Al-Qaeda. And ISIS has its specificities, and the emphasis really on the ideological aspect, I think, draws us away from the political factors, which tend to become then underestimated.
Well, we'll explore all of that in a moment, but Professor, just quickly, a response to the basic data that you have seen.
No, I think that once again, that what you are expecting from us, it's this condemnation and this violence. What we have now, these are groups that are using violence. And the point is that when I was hearing you right now is, if we want to be serious about what is happening and just to tackle the issue of violence and extremists, we need to be very clear on how we are tackling the issue. We have a problem of definition, we have a problem of categorization of the people, and we have a problem of the political issues. And there are many people and many trends that are responsible. I think that this confusion
we'll chew all
is
of that over in a moment. But Usama, to you first of all, I mentioned in the introduction, you were a jihadist, you travelled to Afghanistan. Why did you do that?
I was 19 and I was idealistic, I was naive looking back, and I was fighting to defend Muslims as I saw it in Afghanistan after the Soviet invasion and the communist takeover, and was also fighting for an Islamic state and a kind of global Islamic revolution, which is why ideology is important, and these groups have the common ideology.
We hear a lot about...
However, the human cost is awful, as you referred to.
We hear a lot about radicalisation. I mean, you were 19, you were at Cambridge University. I mean, how do you go from Cambridge University to the foothills of Afghanistan? How did that happen? How did you get drawn in?
Well, it's simple. It is actually ideology. I was fighting for a cause. I saw it as a noble cause, a glorious cause, and parts of that were very well intentioned in terms of defending oppressed people, etc. And it's what motivates a lot of leaders of these groups. Many of the followers go for other reasons, but ideas. For somebody like me who is not aggressive and doesn't get into fights or wouldn't hurt a fly, literally, but I'm willing to fight and die for a greater cause.
Myriam, you've written, haven't you, that it's almost akin, not the same, but akin to youngsters looking at gangs and seeing them and thinking they're cool.
I think we underestimate the similarities between jihadism, as you've called it on the programme, and other forms of criminality. In other words, there are very similar reasons for the disaffection which draws people to countercultural movements, which is what this is in effect for Europeans that are being drawn to the conflict. But I think there are differences between the motivations of individuals from the European context, and I think perhaps the ideological aspect is more salient to some extent. But the ideological component, I think, in the region is massively overstated. The group that calls itself IS or Daesh, and I would reject the term caliphate as accepting their narrative on this one, is not a particularly strong ideological group. It doesn't have a particularly strong narrative. It's not particularly innovative in its outlook, and I think it's much more important to focus on why we have this movement emerge in the region. It's a break-off from Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Iraq, and it's at the conflict, it's at the intersection of two of the bloodiest civil conflicts of our time.
Professor, why do you think people are going? Because people have talked about poverty, people have talked about education. What do you think it is that is drawing people in?
No, I think that what we heard, it's important. There are many reasons. The first one is, and we have to be clear on that there is a religious understanding that we have to address, because there are mindsets that are understanding it's us versus them, and it's us against them, and it's us resisting to their oppression. This is based on specific religious narrative, and we have to tackle this, because we cannot just say it has nothing to do with Islam. It has to do with the wrong understanding and something which is outside Islam. And by the way, it's not new. We had very, sects in the past, what we call al-Khawarij, for example, that were using an understanding of Islam. If you don't agree with us on our understanding of Islam or our understanding of politics, we have the right to kill you. Then the mindset is there. So there is one thing. The second thing is the political understanding that at the end, the West is not fair with the Muslims around the world. And this is one thing which is important. We have to condemn, but we also have to look at ourselves in the West, in the way we are dealing with some governments, with some trends that we are using them. No, that's a very important point.
That is interesting.
We cannot just undermine this by saying it's all, condemnation.
No, I understand that. Why do you think it is that more Muslims from Europe are going rather than, say, Americans? What is behind that?
Actually, this is nothing new. 20 years ago, at least 1,000 British Muslims went to fight in Bosnia during the Bosnian Civil War in defense of Bosnian Muslims who were facing genocide effectively, and many other thousands went from around Europe. So the European deployment is actually on a similar scale, despite all the restriction and war on terror. But one reason why there's fewer Americans, I believe American Muslims are more integrated. America is a different nation, it's an immigrant nation. People come from all over the world as immigrants and integrate there. In Europe, there are issues with Muslim integrating in Europe, partly because of a post-colonial legacy and the racism
difference there.
Which has existed in Europe.
Just a brief final question for now. When was the moment that you, there in Afghanistan, realised this is actually not the right way forward?
I actually thoroughly enjoyed my time in Afghanistan, but and wanted to fight in Bosnia. But when the jihadist movement went towards terrorism and also started fighting each other, so in Afghanistan after 1992, when our Mujahideen leaders took Kabul, we thought there was going to be peace and harmony and a glorious Islamic state or caliphate, because that narrative is important to them. However, what happened next was a 4-year vicious civil war between the Mujahideen leaders, and that taught me that a lot of these people are fighting for power and money and influence, and not for the sake of God or religion or Islam.
Ali Musa, tell me, we were looking there at Boko Haram. Why have we seen a jump in the number of attacks?
Well, basically there are 3 factors that have been responsible for that. One, the first of those factors is the fact that the Nigerian government has not done much to curtail the activities of Boko Haram, and that has emboldened them. If you remember, some years ago, they were not as active as they are today. They went on the ground after they were suppressed in 2009. They regrouped in northern Cameroon. After regrouping, they re-energized and then got more arms. It was from that they were able to fight back, and they're doing what they're doing today. Okay, that factor has also contributed to the next factor I'll be talking about, the source of funding. They have got more sources of funding, and this is really, really helping their campaign of violence in northern Nigeria today.
And do we know where that has come from? Because there is a suggestion that there is now some sort of crossover, some sort of talking between IS and Boko Haram.
Absolutely.
How much evidence is there for that?
Well, at the minute, there isn't much evidence, but it is clear from their activities, from the way things are escalating, that there is some sort of contact, there is some sort of talk going on between ISIS and Boko Haram, and it's been ongoing for a long time. But before then, of course, there has been link between Boko Haram and Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. And of course, they get a lot of funding from them. Of course, nobody can say exactly how much they get from them. But one other thing that has been very, very helpful to their source of funding is kidnap for ransom. And many countries have been helping them by paying this ransom. We know some Western countries have paid a lot of money to them. And this is really, really helping this campaign of violence.
And in the jihadist sense, I mean, how much of a difference, how much similarity is there between those two groups, IS and Boko Haram?
There are lots of differences and then a few similarities. Differences in the sense that we're talking about Boko Haram that has got kind of local roots, is a product of kind of discontent within Nigeria. I mean, where Boko Haram started, it's a place that is very, very deprived. I've argued a number of times that Boko Haram did not just emerge from the blue. It is an offshoot of previous group that existed in the 1980s, known as Metasini group. And because that problem was not treated properly, so it went on the ground. Today, it's kind of amplified to this extent. So in that case, there isn't much link between ISIS and Boko Haram.
We're talking earlier about people being drawn in. It's not just men. We are seeing women go and join IS. Certainly with Boko Haram, we're seeing a number of suicide attacks from women, even the suggestion that some of those schoolgirls who were abducted being used and forced into some of these attacks. In terms of that sort of progression of it, why are we seeing that? What is drawing them in?
I mean, I think it's probably quite problematic to assume that there would be gender-based differences in the motivations. I mean, the attraction of these groups is a sense of idealism, as we heard from Usama, a sense of joining this utopian state. And I think gender differences along those lines aren't necessarily in terms of the motivation, but in the manifestation of that. So women, just as men, could be motivated by the idea of joining an idealized state or group, but the manifestation of that is these very fundamentalist groups who have a very puritanical view of gender roles would then have different manifestations of those roles. So while the men might go and fight, women would tend to have more domestic roles.
Professor, in terms of people going to join IS, a lot from North Africa. Just explain why.
Why they're coming from North Africa?
Yes.
I think no, they are not only coming from North Africa. I think they are coming from the region. It's much more than that. It's just not one region. And some now, the connection came afterward. I think that we need to understand the local dynamics. It's just not to confuse everything. What happened in Boko Haram in Nigeria, it's something which has to be understood from there. And then what is happening first in Syria, because it started in the region in Syria with people resisting to Bashar and then within having infiltration and then the connection with Iraq. So once again, this dynamic and people coming in. I think that we need to understand here is that when it comes to this understanding of Islam, first we need to understand the background and then the political situation on the ground, because this is where if we don't do this, we are just, that this is violence and they are killing. No, there are reasons for killing, there are reasons for resisting, and there are reasons even though we condemn. So condemn is not the whole issue. To condemn and to count the number of people who are killed, it's not enough. It's really to go further than that. And from a religious background and a religious viewpoint, what was said is important. We have to fight against this understanding of jihad and this. And by the way, your definitions on the BBC website is wrong. It has nothing to do with holy war. It's not an Islamic concept, holy war. So we have to come to something which is deeper here when it comes to religion and more sophisticated when it comes to politics.
And in terms of Boko Haram, are they expanding their reach?
Exactly. They have been doing that, and in my book I've argued that if something is not done, they are not just going to take part of northeast of Nigeria. They will certainly occupy part of West African sub-region, including countries like Cameroon, including countries like Chad, including Niger. At the minute, of course, there is this allegation that the Chadian government is somehow supporting or bankrolling the activities, which I am not sure how far that is true. But the fact is, if nothing is done by governments in that region, they need a kind of joint intelligence gathering. They need a kind of combination of forces to counter that force that Boko Haram is today. If something is not done and they get enough connection from ISIS and Al-Qaeda in Islamic Maghreb, then it could be kind of blown out of proportion.
Usama, in terms of the basic data that we've had today, I mean, 60% of the jihadist deaths are carried out by groups with no formal link with Al-Qaeda. So we're seeing a proliferation, aren't we, of groups?
Yeah, certainly. But they all have very similar ideology in terms of using religion, ideas of jihad to fight local political wars. Once Al-Qaeda let their genie out of the bottle, if you like, it has spread everywhere. And it should be emphasized that this is often a Muslim battle. Most of their victims are Muslims. Boko Haram attack loads of mosques. I've known people who've survived attacks on mosques, including Kano, the most symbolic mosque in Nigeria recently. And people are fighting back. So, for example, governments and militaries of, say, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Syria, Nigeria, where half the military is Muslim, they see their struggle against these groups as a jihad also, as a sacred war, a sacred struggle for what is right, to resist rebels and terrorists. So it's a lot more complicated than simply these people taking the idea of jihad. I think we should call them takfiris or something else, you know, rebels, heretics, because really Muslims like the word jihad. It's a very noble concept in the Quran, and we won't accept it being hijacked by these people.
So just a quick thought on just the basic premise here that, in effect, all of IS is what he is saying are Muslims. It is a problem for Muslims.
It's a problem for Muslims to deal with, but that particular view is very naive and very ignorant, actually, because he's accepting the claim of Al-Qaeda and IS that they represent true Islam. And he's accepting that claim and saying, therefore, Islam is a problem, which, as I said, is utterly ignorant. And what we have in Islam is centuries of debate around these issues. We've had rebels and violent groups like this before, and Muslims have a rich civilization and theology and spirituality and everything else, very broad and very deep. And we have immense resources to fight back against this kind of thing, which is going on all over the world. It's not just, well, let's get rid of Islam and we'll solve the problem.
This has been something that's been talked about for a while. Should Muslims stand up, condemn what we're seeing? You are very clear in your mind that there's a premise of guilt there that is wrong.
Well, the presumption that anybody should have to apologise for or condemn an action which they directly have no bearing upon is a presumption of guilt, which is entirely problematic. The fact is, scholarly figures, so figures of authority within Islam, can and absolutely do condemn these actions. But your average lay Muslim has no more or less responsibility to try and tackle Boko Haram in Nigeria or ISIS in Iraq and Syria than any other citizen. And I think part of the problem is the way that we discuss these issues. You know, when we essentialize them and render them Islamic problems, terming them jihad, rather than assessing the sort of complex political factors at hand, what we're really talking about is a violence which is problematic and requires a solution. The solution is a political one because the problem is political. That doesn't mean there aren't ideological similarities in some senses across these movements, but the solution to these problems are localized, and those are the things we ought to be talking about.
Professor, where are you on this notion of condemnation? Because, Usama, you were making the point when we were talking before that, and used the phrase, we need to recapture Islam from those voices. Where are you on this?
I think it's right, but I think we need more, media coverage on other voices, not only when we have a problem with violent extremism, and to listen, because many people are telling us, you don't speak enough, but we are not always heard, and we don't have primetime TV program when we can speak. And I think we have to do the three things. The first is, once again, to have a clear religious discourse on why the way they are using jihad, the way they are using even Islamic State or Caliphate is wrong. So we need to do this work, and we are doing it, but we need to make it heard, to spread this message that what is Islam. This is the first thing that we have to do. There is a second thing that we have to do, is that behind this, because we had in the past people who were extremists and using Islam, there is a mindset here. And this, I don't call them fundamentalists. I talk about literalist and dogmatic minds. And once again, here there is something that is needed from the Muslim scholars, is to be quite clear on this very narrow interpretation of Islam that it's upstream from all the use towards violence. We have to come to this. And there is a third thing that we have to do, because we can't just speak about Islam. What he's doing here by saying this is Islam is just very simplistic, not taking into account the political dimension. And this is where we, once again, and me as a European, I have to be clear on which type of Islam I'm promoting, but also not to be naive on the political arena, where we have our own government sometimes dealing with people who have a very narrow understanding of Islam, a binary vision of Islam, and then they come to us and say, you have to condemn, but you have to be consistent. The British government, the European government should be consistent when it comes to with whom you are dealing, not only when it comes to violence.
And Doctor, in a sense, the definition has evolved. I mean, at what point did it evolve to take in the killing of other Muslims?
Well, the first thing actually is to look at the narrative of the violence in the media itself. Look at the Boko Haram crisis, for instance. The kind of narrative that is given, it's like a kind of war in which Muslims are trying to exterminate Christians in northern Nigeria and so on. And this is completely wrong. We have a problem on ground. people believe that, there are people that have argued that it's a problem for Islam. It's not a problem for Islam. It's a problem for Muslims to tackle, just like Professor has argued. It's a problem for us to now try to change that narrative, make the world aware of the fact that this is not Islam.
Okay. The sorts of tools that extremists can use, what is the best way, do you think, to combat the various threats?
These songs, of course, are popular in culture all around the world. So counter songs, if you like one man was there spreading a peaceful, moderate, but also a deeper message of Islam through songs is a counter-effective method to do that, because you know, I grew up listening to some of those songs. They came out of the Muslim Brotherhood prisoners who were imprisoned and tortured in Egypt's prisons. And they're actually very powerful and emotive songs talking about death and martyrdom and fighting for the sake of God, etc. And they continue to this day around the world, performed at weddings and parties and other places. But thank God, 95% of that market is, if you like, beautiful spiritual songs, and those need to be amplified. And of course, the underlying ideology, if that is countered, then the positive ideas which come out of that will make their way into positive songs.
Your organisation, the Quilliam Foundation, does a lot of work in trying to combat the threat and counter some of these pressures. What are the key gaps that need to be closed, do you think, currently?
We have to challenge some of the classic notions rooted in the Quran, which the rebels misuse. So concepts like Ummah, the Muslim nation, Sharia, Jihad and Caliphate, they take very narrow and twisted interpretations of all of those. We try to promote, you know, balance and deeper versions of that. There's also an issue about Islam and the state, religion and politics, and how far do you separate religion from the state? You know, do you have to have an Islamic state or a secular state or an Islamic secular state? Is there such a thing? That's a very crucial distinction.
And Professor, you've written about the same thing, which is interpretation and a problem almost, that there's not a central figure.
It is a central, the question for us today is, there is one Islam as to the scriptural sources and the main principles. There are many interpretations, but we have to draw a limit. There are interpretations that are not Islamic. They are even anti-Islamic, and we have to be clear on this. So what is said about, you know, defining the concepts, understanding the message, but at the same time understanding the diversity. It's very important when we have dogmatic minds to make it clear that Islam has many interpretations and that we have to be open to interpretations with the limits that if anybody who's coming to tell me you can kill innocent people, this is not an accepted interpretation. This is outside. So we have to do this. And let me tell you something, because you were asking a question about what we can do. Paradoxically, the best way today to do something against this perception that we are marginalized, stigmatized as Muslims is to come worldwide with a better narrative about Islam. It's really important not to focus on the extremists that are less than 1%, these are marginal people, and to come to something which is in the West as well, because we are asking, why are they going? It's a better narrative, to better understanding of Islam. And the politicians in the West, sometimes they are targeting the extremists, and the journalists are doing the same. And we have a common responsibility here about Islam.
Doctor, we were talking about questions from the audience and viewers, and one of the questions that has come in points to Boko Haram, saying if you look at the list here in terms of casualties, the numbers, the attacks from Boko Haram, given just the extent of it, why hasn't the West intervened like it has elsewhere?
Well, I think the main problem is within the government in Nigeria, the willingness of the government whether to accommodate some sort of assistance from foreign powers and so on. Now, there is this sort of distrust between Nigerian government and foreign government. For instance, American government and Nigeria have been arguing over the fact that Nigerian military have carried out all sorts of human rights abuses that now makes it impossible for the American government to support Nigeria militarily. And of course, the fact that the government in Nigeria has not done much to curtail abuse of human rights has made it very difficult for America to come in. But then the most important problem there is that the Nigerian government is not doing its job properly, because if they are not taking the responsibility of securing lives and property of people, then no one else is going to do it. This is an internal problem. You start doing something. By the time you're doing something, then people from outside can come out to support you. It's not just possible for outsiders to come out with a kind of magic wand and solve the problem for you overnight.
What is the way to look at data like this and to try to make progress?
I think it's important to situate ideology in its proper context. So ideology has its place as an explanatory variable, but extremist ideology is really just the cultural lexicon of radical Muslims in a particular context, and they are radicalized because of a political context. If you want a solution to radicalization, you look at the context which has fostered that. In Europe, if we're talking about European Muslims, we need to look at the disenfranchisement of Muslims, why there is a sense of alienation among certain Muslims. If you want to look locally in Iraq and Syria, let's talk about the conflicts. If you want a long-term solution to this, we need stable states in the region that can actually operate a sense of security, that can actually monitor their borders, that can actually assert some control in the region. We need a long-term solution to the Syrian conflict. There is no discussion of that. We all favor discussions about ideology as if it's something out there that Muslims need to deal with. No, these are real political conflicts that require political solutions.
Yes, I think if I may just add something here, which is
very briefly, because we're almost out of time.
It's about freedom, it's about dignity of the people. It's not about the conflict. What they want, and we saw this with people taking to the street in all these countries, that they want freedom. So we have to support the true democratization, not dictators that are helping our interests, but true democratic processes that help letting the people live and to be dignified in their life. That's so important.
Well, there we have to leave it. We have run out of time. Thanks to all of you for being with me here throughout the course of the programme.